Welcome everyone to my YouTube channel. This is Video Chess Training on YouTube. I'm International Master Will Paschall, and today we're going to be doing a weekly review video of some games I've played online featuring one particular defense, in this case the King's Indian. So a little review video for the week looking at some King's Indians I've played recently. These don't have to be theoretical, they can be practical games against amateurs or maybe in some cases kind of theoretical battles. The first example was a game I played on my live stream. This is against amateur player. I'm playing black. It's a King's Indian against Schufel. He's rated around 1800 here on Lichess. Plays d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, knight f3, castles. Against knight f3 or even against e4, you can delay castling by playing d6. There is some difference in some particular lines. You might want to delay d6. For example, let's say you'd like to play c5 and turn it into a Benoni or something. You might benefit by not playing d6. For example, if my opponent plays bishop g5 here, black could opt for a c5 type of formation, where you might only want to play d6 at a later time. So there's some benefit and differences really between playing castles and d6. Here my opponent plays e4. Let's just stop this engine for a minute. We have d6, bishop e2, and here I like to play different moves. Basically I can play e5, classical King's Indian, knight a6, which usually means I'm going to play e5 a move or two later. And also I like to play occasionally c5, transferring to a sort of Benoni. Other moves include bishop g4, which is a kind of side variation. It's not highly regarded, but kind of good to take people out of book. It's not a great surprise weapon much anymore. That's pretty much it. You can play knight on b to d7. That's a kind of old school King's Indian. Alright, so we played e5. Of course, if I'm playing a lower rated player, I'm always thinking, please don't play the exchange variation with d takes e. That's something to be said about knight a6. The exchange variation not quite as good after knight a6. So one of the reasons for that move order, knight a6 or knight on bd7, some professionals don't like to face the exchange variation straight up, which is often very drawish and difficult to play for a win as black. So I played e5, and my opponent played here castles, and he's looking for, well, likely a classical King's Indian. So my backstory as far as the King's Indian goes, I tried to play the Mar del Plata first in the early stages of my chess career, learning the King's Indian. Mar del Plata being, knight to c6 here, followed by d5 and knight e7. But my problem with this knight to c6, d5, e7 is that play from this point onward is very, very controlled by pawn structures and space advantage on one side or the other. It becomes a race, basically. And the positions are very closed, and a lot of theoretical knowledge is really necessary. So I personally like to play more open positions, and with that in mind, I've kind of always leaned toward playing other side variations here that don't allow the center to be locked immediately. So it requires a little less theory, and it also allows you to play a more open position if you play either knight a6 or knight bd7, or in this case, as in the game, pawn takes pawn. We're giving up our central pawn, and this is a lot like for example, the exchange Philidor, where black plays e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, e takes d4. Except that in the Philidor, white hasn't played c4. Here we're facing a kind of Marazzi structure, which is okay for me because I actually play the Marazzi for black. Of course, in that case, if it was a Sicilian, we'd have a pawn on e7 instead of on c7. Our pawns would have a better structure essentially, with the 5-pawn island and the pawns not being segmented into the worst half of the pawn structures here. I think white has a better structure theoretically. This pawn on e4 is very powerful, and with the ability to play f3, it's difficult for black to break it. Okay, so anyway, enough said here. Rook e8. There are other moves. This is the main one. You can also play c6 here, and knight c6. But in those variations, typically you're going to play rook e8 anyway at some early point. And here, white plays bishop d3. This is a very strange move because my opponent doesn't know the theory. He just reacts. But generally speaking, pawns should defend pawns, not pieces. It wouldn't be so bad if white hadn't already spent a tempo on playing bishop e2. But here it's not only defending the pawn the wrong way, he's like losing a move essentially by moving his bishop twice in the early stage of the opening. So f3 is the best move. This is typical theory. Black has different lines here. Knight h5, c6, knight c6, so there's all different possibilities. But white should be slightly better in those lines. Black has given up the strong point on d4 for open play. Okay, now my opponent could also play bishop f3. I noticed there was a game here, Korchnoi-Ullman from 2004. That's pretty bizarre. It must have been one of these like senior championships or special senior tournaments. I couldn't imagine where Korchnoi would have played Ullman otherwise. At that late date in 2004, it was probably kind of a friendly senior tournament, and played bishop f3 and drew with the Ullman there. But bishop f3 not really great for white either. Same problem. The piece is obstructed. It's not in a good position. You're moving it twice. It's tied down to the e4 pawn. So moving forward here, my opponent played bishop d3. Now, interestingly here, there is one game, if you look in the opening database here, Rodriguez versus Lescovar from Argentina. Lescovar plays the move that's the move you play in a blitz game, knight to g4. It's very logical, but it doesn't quite make sense here because the position is very similar to, like, let's say a Scotch, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, g6. But I think unlike in the Scotch, this situation is just a little bit different. I mean, white can bring this knight back to f3. I think that's a good enough defense for white. Like knight to g4, Rodriguez, this guy played knight ge2, but knight f3, if we turn on the computer engine here, it looks to me like white is just about equal. I think I noticed a different variation that was kind of similar a little bit later on, but I'm not convinced by knight g4. Lescovar's move I think is not great, and white made a mistake maybe by not retreating his knight back to f3. So anyway, that's too early, but the good move here for black seems to be knight to c6. If we play knight to c6, we're challenging the strong knight on d4, and now we're talking Scotch position, right? This is how it can become a Scotch. Knight takes c6, b takes c6, and it's like a g6 Scotch where white played c4, which is a position I've actually had on the stream here. And now we really are threatening stuff like knight g4, queen h4, and playing the knight back to e5. Nesbedinov, the famous attacking player, was very fond of these kind of piece maneuvers, the black side of the King's Indian, and knew those positions very well. Recommend you check out his games. But knight c6 is the best move. I played another move that's a little more fluid. Here, knight to a6, keeping the possibility of pieces like staying on the board, and c6. This is also fine for black, an alternative way of playing. Then a3. This move looks slow. I'm not really sure what the best move is for white here. Probably he could play bishop g5 as he did in the game, something along those lines. Maybe rook e1, f3, all these moves seem kind of reasonable. But a3 looks like an unnecessary weakening move, basically. Knight to c5, and now most people I would think about keeping this bishop. It's not a great piece though. You know, bishop c2, maybe it's more about embarrassing the knight on c5 later on than saving the bishop. But he played a good move, bishop g5. I thought, sorry, rook e1, bishop g5 is next. Rook e1's not great. I think bishop g5 would be a better try here for white. Rook e1 left some tactical possibilities in the position I felt. So maybe bishop c2 though, the most logical move for white in this position. Just not allowing tactics. Oh no, it doesn't work because he can play knight takes e4. Okay, sorry about that. So we have to take that back and say he does have to protect his pawn. Okay, so f3. I'm going to get in d5 in some positions. I was even thinking about d5 a little bit later, but yeah, perhaps bishop g5 instead of defending with bishop c2. There's no time. Okay, h6, and then the question is, if h6, bishop h4, what do I do? G5? Yeah, g5, we're winning a pawn again. So this bishop g5, he'd have to trade his bishop. That's also not good. It looks like after knight c5, truly he did play the best move, rook e1. Or bishop c2 isn't possible, right? Rook e1, this is probably better than f3. It's less weakening. And now I knew that I had a good position, but I wasn't really sure how to continue here. So there was a lot of thought going into this position. I wanted to play something like knight to g4, but again, I'm not really convinced by it. I looked at this variation, similar to Lescavar's knight to g4, but a little bit later, and the computer was like trying to turn it into a Nimzo Indian. I think this is a very provocative and interesting way for black to play. Had this been the actual game continuation, bishop takes c3, risky for black, you know, creating some weaknesses on the dark squares around my king that later on could be costly. Bishop takes c3, queen f6. So literally like turning this king's Indian into what looks like more like a Nimzo. It's pretty risky for black long term, but I like black structure. All the black pieces are good. For example, I looked at bishop g5 here. First, I think he has to protect the pawn. Maybe queen c2, bishop d7 with this idea of a4, and then bishop g5. And so this kind of position where the queen is actually fianchettoed on g7. Pretty neat situation, and I think there's a good chance white could put a knight on d4, which would be quite a strong piece, but that's actually the next move. I think that white has a little bit of compensation for the bad structure based on black having some weak squares. It wouldn't be so easy for black to make progress in this position. But that's a provocative idea. And then finally, rather than do anything crazy, we could just make a normal move like knight e5, for example. Maybe trading pieces, but it looks relatively equal to me. So finally in the game, I didn't play knight g4. Instead, I played here bishop d7, and white played bishop g5. And now we've got issues with this pin here, and it's kind of difficult to get out. We'll play h6. We don't intend to play g5. We could play g5 here, but I don't really like, in general, creating this weak square. And the computer found an interesting line here: g5, bishop g3, knight h5. Only possible. I did look at this during the blitz game, but it was 5-5 pretty fast. Only possible because this bishop was hanging on d3. Interesting, but at the end of the day, I mean, it looks like white has play because this f5 square is quite weak. So not that clear, a little bit inflexible for black. So I opted for instead c6, which is more fluid, keeping our options open, keeping the f5 square under control. And then white reacted with rook b1. And now I really desperately wanted to get out of the pin without weakening myself unnecessarily with g5, so I played queen b6. And then we had to contend with b4. The idea here was to exploit the knight hanging on d4. But in this case, I think we have a couple different outs. If b4, my first plan was to play knight a4. This actually turns out to be more complicated than I thought it was, because he can take on a4. He could also play this bizarre move, knight on c to e2, which I didn't see. But in that variation, it looks like we can play like knight c3, at the very least, simplify the position when black feels quite solid here. White looks a little bit okay, but kind of a tiny bit overextended, let's say. I analyzed, I think, knight e2, queen b6, c5, D takes c5, B takes c5, queen takes c5, and rook takes b7, with chances for both sides. This classic cop-out evaluation, but realistically, I think that's a fair evaluation here. So it looks kind of dynamic. This pawn is hanging. White has a strong pawn on e4 that's somewhat vulnerable. Maybe black's a little better though. It's fairly close. So going back to the game, after rook b1, we played queen b6. Our opponent then played knight f3, and I wanted to show you guys one other thing. Going back, I forgot to mention, if we had one chance earlier in this position, instead of bishop d7, I forgot to mention there was a really cool move here, d5, which I did mention during the live stream. And I think that Blue Crow or someone else who watches my live stream was checking this out too. This is a way to equalize for black. It looks like it concretely was the best move in this position. I was saying I think there's something better than bishop d7. And d5, it's like Steinitz did this in the g6, Scotch, in some famous games. This is the whole point. In this case, I can play d5 without even having to play c6. So it's really cool. I just didn't have time to calculate. Like c takes d5, I can play. I was actually looking at knight takes d5 here, I think. Yeah, you can play knight takes d5 right away. It's like super complicated, but really cool concept. We could also play knight takes d5, d3. This is more simple. Knight takes d3, queen takes d3, knight takes d5, and like Steinitz in a g6 Scotch, we have just like picked up the two bishops. It looks like black has a good game. So my instincts were right, you know, that we did have a good way to equalize in this game. Instead, I played this slower move, bishop d7. Maybe a better winning attempt. I don't know, keeping pieces on the board, keeping the game complicated. So c6, rook b1, queen b6, and now not b4, but our opponent played, again, let's turn the engine off. We played rook b1, queen b6, knight f3, queen b6, knight f3, because the knight was hanging, and black to move here. What are we going to do? Queen b3. This move was in a situation where I was starting to get into really bad time pressure. So probably, rather than seek complications, I should play bishop g4 here. Kind of Benoni idea. And simplifying, get good control over the dark squares. Everything is kind of focused. That bishop on g7, queen on b6. The bishop on d7 is sort of lost. It's like a lost puppy. It doesn't really know how it's going to influence the center. So I think bishop g4 would give black like concretely organized counterplay on the dark squares. This was time pressure. The game starts to deteriorate here. Queen b3, bishop c2. We pick up a pawn with queen takes c4. And if we turn the engine on, it looks like black is starting to get the upper hand here. Not so simple. He could take the pawn on d6. This was unclear. So after this move, he makes some mistakes and things deteriorate pretty quickly. We don't have to see the whole game. D takes e5 until the position is decisive. This was a blunder, this e5. So instead of that, again, queen takes d6. And I don't remember what I intended here. I figured I had a lot of different options. Rook a d8 walks into a pin. So it's trickier than I thought. Something like knight g4, knight h5, maybe g5, all different options. But white is still in the game here. I got a little bit carried away with queen b3, not a good move. But white played bishop c2, queen takes c4, e5. And the rest is time pressure, basically. Really bad time pressure for both sides. So the game just deteriorated here. Bishop g3, and now I did bishop g4. Now I'm up 2 pawns, so simplifying makes a lot of sense. But I waited too long to pull the trigger on bishop g4. h3, bishop takes f3 is fine. I played rook d8, and then queen e2, queen takes e2, and it's over. I'm 2 pawns up here. And white doesn't have any compensation after rook takes, bishop takes. shattered structure, and 2 pawns down. So that's enough for that game. But I thought the opening, kind of interesting. White made the mistake of defending, the central pawn with bishop d3, and I made some inaccuracies too. Now, if we go back here, I go back to my profile, and I'm going to search for another game I played recently with one particular opponent in a tournament. This was played in a blitz tournament. We'll go to analysis board, turn off the engine because that makes this slower. So here we are, King's Indian again, and this was from a 5-0 blitz tournament. So this is another game where the game melts down later on, but it's worth taking a look at the opening. So King's Indian, and white plays knight c3, bishop g7, and this time e4. So I'm not really, honestly, sure whether I prefer castles or d6. I think d6 may be a little more flexible. Fischer used to play castles. By the way, I mean, this is quite an interesting variation. This was in Fischer's my 50 memorable games. Here, 98. This variation is really kind of sharp. I think that you need to be prepared in this, actually. So if you do just choose to play the castles move order, check out the famous Fischer game against, I don't remember who it was, but Letelier or someone like that. I'm not sure, but that's important to know if you do choose that move order. But anyway, so d6, knight f3, castles, and now bishop d3. This was a random guy who was around 2100 in a blitz tournament here on LeeChess.org, and this is just a move you never run into. And I was thinking, well, yeah, you can play e5, like it looks like a classical sort of Makaganov variation, but I think that my move in the game is best. So maybe if you desperately want to keep all the pieces on the board, you should play e5 here. But it looks like, looking at some games, it's going to transpose to this is going to transpose to some theory. I mean, after this a5, white plays h3, we're transposing directly into a Makaganov system, where the theory gets really deep. Knight a6, castles, and then there's all different stuff. Knight h5, knight c5. This is not an easy game for black. These lines are extremely, queen e8 is another idea. These lines are extremely, extremely critical and extremely difficult for black. So I think that this is clearly important, what I did here to play bishop g4. This is the only move that, like, equalizes on the spot. And if you notice, the first game in the list here, the Grandmaster Damjanovic, he's like one of the biggest experts in the King's Indian you can think of. I mean, he's very respected. So if he plays it, I mean, it's got to be good. Juric has apparently played this line for white a couple times. But good players, Damjanovic, Trotar. But especially the fact that Damjanovic played bishop g4, it looks good. So I've seen some games where white actually loses a tempo and plays bishop e2 here. Or after bishop e3, we'll play bishop e2. You could actually play a bishop g4 King's Indian down a tempo. It's hard to recommend something better. Check out what happens here. h3, logical, right? Bishop takes f3. Now, I guess you could play g takes f3. Let's check out what the engine thinks about it. G takes f3. Well, the computer doesn't like the structure too much. I don't know. It seems like it's playable for white, but I would think that black would be happy to do some damage to the white structure. But probably white can play this if he wants a really complicated game. So instead, queen takes f3, knight c6, putting pressure on the d4 point. And now I would think that white could consider something like d5 here. Maybe it's not a bad idea to play d5 straight away. And before things get any more nasty, d5, and black can either play knight e5 and trade the bishop on d3, or play knight d4 just to establish a piece on d4. That's probably white's best, because here he plays logically bishop e3, knight d7. We're following a couple games, pretty random games, and White, I didn't realize in this position, white is actually literally forced to play d5 because it turns out it's the only move. d5, knight d4, or knight e5 again. Looks like black is slightly better. And the computer is even looking at bishop takes c3. I don't know about that. But considering how few pieces are left on the board after I'm exchanging that and another set of minor pieces, you could consider again like this Nimzo-Indian kind of concept to be a valid way for black to defend this position. In the endgame, maybe the double pawns would be a real liability. But I think I would probably go for knight d4, knight e5. So that's white's best. But my opponent, naturally, it's a 5-0 game, played this move. And I've never seen this theme before. It's really an instructive eye-opener. I'm actually winning 2 pawns, basically by force in this position, and winning the equivalent of like 3 points of material. And I did not see it because I'm not looking for it. This is not a theme that I've ever encountered, and I don't really play the bishop g4 variation of the King's Indian. And even if I did, I'm not sure this can happen in that line as well. So knight d e5, just winning immediately, winning a piece. It's beautiful. D takes e5, not a piece, but a piece worth of pawns. D takes e5, knight takes e5, queen g3, knight takes d3 check. Everything falls apart. He loses his castling rights. There was an actual game where 2,200 players and white didn't resign. It's unbelievable. I would just resign out of disgust, but white continued with rook c1, and then black played c5. Just for the sake of argument here, I like the computer's move queen d7 better. You know, it feels nice, you know, to just get this queen to a really mobile position, create no weaknesses. The knight's got plenty of ways to get out by d3, a4. If you want to play c5 later on, that's fine, but I really like queen d7. Black is just winning. It's just a winning position. So I missed this, but I'm not ashamed because this is certainly a theme I've never seen before. So I played the more typical kind of thematic move, e5, and now after d5, knight to d4, white is still okay. Obviously he's not losing material, but this is like a very, very good bishop g4 King's Indian where black has handily equalized. And then knight takes d4, pawn takes d4, bishop d2. White sort of sets up to blockade, but black is a little bit better. We have dark square blockade, much like accelerated dragon for black, good outposts on c5, e5. And the problem is winning the game, much like in accelerated dragon blockade positions. The problem and the difficulty arises in winning the game. I would need to open lines somehow, and if you look here, you'll see that the computer engine's finding like f5. The idea being f5, e takes f5. We don't take back, we leave him like with a position where his white squared bishop could be a powerful piece. But I think knight e5, queen moves, you know, knight takes d3 check, queen takes d3 check, then maybe some finesse, but in this kind of position it appears queen e8 check, it appears queen e2, d3, and white is on the way to being clearly worse. Or king f1, like rook takes f5, black is better, passed pawn, and a very strong pressure along the f file with rook takes f5. So, though Stockfish says that white is equal here, I think in a practical game, that's not really very realistic. I mean, black has a passed pawn. Black has more active pieces, some play along the g file, I mean the f file. So I think that practically speaking, this is easier to play for black. That would be an active way for me to play. But I wanted to try to increase the pressure with just a pure blockade. This is sort of against principles, opening up white squares when the other guy has a white square bishop on the board. So I wanted to try to anchor the dark square blockade with a5. Knight c5 is another idea. And you may wonder why I play here queen h4, but I had a very, very concrete idea. Earlier, I had played a game where I traded dark squared bishops against one opponent in a similar structure like this. And we can hopefully think about bishop h6 and negotiate some kind of ending where we have gray control of the dark squares, and the dark square control is powerful. We have a knight that's very, very good on dark squares, and the bishop is like a pawn. It's blocked by its own pawns on c4 and e4. So typical Marazzi. I don't mind this exchange of bishop h6, and I think thematically bishop h6 makes sense. When you're in any kind of position with bishop and knight against two bishops, you should always, usually more importantly when you're on the defense, because here I'm not, but when you have bishop and knight against two bishops, if you're on the defensive, I would say trading off one of the bishop pair is usually the right idea. So that never came to fruition. My opponent played rook e1. I decided to change my mind, not play bishop h6, and played knight c5, bishop f1. I don't know that that's necessary. Rook e8, and there maybe I could have played f5. But I was reticent to weaken the white squares again. But I waited too long to pull the trigger here, and we started to get in time pressure, got kicked back. I traded queens, and now white is okay. This is probably a draw, this position objectively. f3, I should have played h5, and in fact, I almost lost the game trying to overpress. So at this point, I just have to kind of content myself with a draw, but I thought in time pressure, white might make some mistakes, so I overpressed. I pushed my protected, kind of like a protected pass pawn, pushed my pass pawn a little too far, like Magnus Carlsen against Richard Rapport, pushing the d3 a little bit too much, not a good idea. And he exchanges here. This is actually a bad decision. He goes in opposite color bishops, and we're okay now. We're very active. Opposite color bishop positions, you have to consider that the initiative is more important than material. So there he should have blockaded my pawn. I've got counterplay with f5, and I actually allow him to open up the white squares now because we're trying to break through along the e file. And then rook takes e2, bishop takes e2. We almost got to a big advantage here, and I don't even have to recapture this pawn on f5. I'm thinking maybe just rook e8 right away in this position is slightly more accurate. So still, white with best play can probably draw here. This was a mistake. Again, not blockading the passed pawn, and I missed a very big opportunity to play a3 in this position. And the reason why a3 is strong is because it's not about even isolating his pawn on a2 or really anything, or allowing him to play b3. It's about securing c3 for my bishop, so my rook can come along through the e file and infiltrate down to like e1, when the bishop on c3 will help support the rook coming to e1. So we can create a really, really dangerous combination there. But in time pressure, I didn't see it, and I played rook e8 right away, and then he plays rook d1. Now it's hard to make progress. I played this desperate move in time pressure, which was just really, really, really dumb. f4, and now I'm slightly worse. And so, oddly enough, we got to this position at the end, and this is still a draw. I should exchange rooks and be drawing in opposite color bishops. But we were both low on time. I played for a win with this insane move, rook g8, and the end is kind of comical, just not really relevant to the video here, but just for entertainment purposes. I thought I was going to lose, but we did not lose the game. We were losing, but never completely lost. Rook h1, we kept attacking his pawns, and then eventually created the ultimate mating net with king f6, threatening rook e3 mate. And of course he could play f5 here to get out of the mating net, but he played instead this very awkward move, rook e2, and I get a passed pawn on the h file, and I ended up winning after that. Passed pawn on the h file. He has to guard the c pawn as well. Passed pawn on the h file, and he's lost. So there's a threat of mate, and there's the passed pawn on the h file. Not a great game, again, marred by time pressure, but you got a good view of how the King's Indian should be played against this early bishop d3. Now, finally, I want to show you guys one more game. This was saving the best for last here from my recent adventures here on Lichess. We were black in a game. Here it is. One of our regular contributors who plays us a lot here on the stream recently, this account, Perry Ode, we faced many times already, and my score is not so good against him. He's played exceptionally well. And this particular opponent likes to play fianchetto on the king's side. So he's kind of expert with g3 type formations. Particularly the Catalan. When I've played knight f6 and e6, he's done very well with that sort of setup. So I decided we'll try the King's Indian. And we get a King's Indian this time, but with g3. I think this is an accurate move order. I was talking about this recently on my live stream. If you play against the Grunfeld with white, for example, you've got a lot of options. Rather than committing the knight too early to c3, it's probably best, if you do want a fianchetto, play an early g3. You don't have to commit your knight to c3. So anyway, he plays bishop g2, we castle, and then he does play knight c3. It's a different situation now, because the Grunfeld is not possible. So black can still play c6. In that case, white could play e4. Once the Grunfeld is kind of ruled out, I think it's okay to play knight c3. Or more accurate, anyway. So classical g3 King's Indian. Now obviously he could play something weird like e4 or e3 and knight e2, which is perfectly playable, more conservative, but he plays knight f3. And now I've been playing, well, basically for the last 20 years, primarily setups based on c6, the so-called Kovalek variation. But I think I played this against this particular opponent once before, and I thought, well, maybe he'll be prepared for that. So I had been studying playing white in some recent King's Indians, and one of the variations I really noticed one of my opponents having a very solid score with was this Pano variation with knight c6, and then not the main line, which is like a6, rook b8, bishop d7, etc. By the way, I think knight c6 might be black's best move overall in the g3 King's Indian. It is probably the most trendy. If we look here, yes, knight c6 is most popular. There was a time when knight on bd7, and Kasparov was a big supporter of knight bd7, but I think that the modern grandmasters like Bologan have basically experts in the King's Indian have been moving more toward knight to c6. There was a recent game in Wekenze, I think, with the game with knight to c6. Anyway, castles, bishop f5. You know, this is a side variation. The main line is by far a6, followed by rook b8. But I think bishop f5 is really, really solid. And here white has more or less two main choices. It's very tempting for white to play some move like knight h4. But I don't think objectively that's good, putting the knight on the side of the board. White needs to decide either if he wants to play with d5 and a very aggressive expanded pawn chain, or if he wants to play conservatively with something like b3, because I think b3 is okay. b3, but I was prepared to play this with white, and these positions are extremely, extremely tough and extremely solid for black. So it's not easy for white to get an advantage in this line. I think if you want something for black in the King's Indian against g3 that's fairly solid, not too wild, bishop f5, knight c6 and bishop f5, it's a good line. According to the books, I think it's called like the lesser Smagin variation. Knight e4, that would be typical there. But okay, Periodi seems to know a lot of theory, and this is my first time playing this. If you look here, Satovsky, Laznikov versus Vacher, Ivanchuk Smirin, this is another guy who's on the top of the list. If you're talking about, maybe he's not 2750, but Smirin is definitely one of the biggest King's Indian experts. So those are just some examples. Smirin, Vacher, Satovsky. Okay, good variation for black. Now, knight a5 is basically the main move. I mean, there's some moves, and knight b8 is not a real move. So the idea is this pawn on c4 is a target. b4 will open up tactics for black along the long diagonal. So now the main move for white is knight to d4. Let me see that for a second. But the knight to d4 is not obvious at first sight, because you're like offering this pawn here on c4. So what happens if knight takes c4? And we'll check with the engine here, but this I think is gotta be just bad. I mean, you just take on f5 and yeah, it's a fork. So you're gonna lose the f5 pawn, queen d3, and I'm surprised there's no amateur has ever tried this or something, but it's basically just not really good for black. You know, this pawn is too important. The kingside structure is broken up. But nevertheless, you would think that there'd be like one guy who'd just like ask the question, what would happen if knight takes c4? So knight d4, more aggressive, but still there's tons of games. Black's score is not bad. I like bishop d7. I don't really see bishop g4 necessarily being beneficial. You know, that's something played in some similar lines, but bishop d7, this would be. The problem here is that there's no knight on d2 to protect the pawn on c4. So basically what usually happens is b3, and then we break this with c5, and now d takes c6 is the main line. D takes c6, knight takes c6, or b takes c6. And b takes c6 is the move that has the better score for black. So I was looking at this originally from white's perspective, but having a hard time, in fact, having a hard time finding, you know, a way for white to prove an advantage in these variations. So it's worth looking at. Not easy. Let's say e4. Black seems to have a fair amount of counterplay. c5. And life just isn't that easy. Judith Polgar. That's always good to see. She loved to play the King's Indian. But I'm not convinced that white necessarily has an easy time getting an advantage in these variations. So knight d4, knight d2, difficult to say which is better. I think the game in question was in Tata B. I was talking about a recent game in the Tata tournament. I think it was played in the B tournament, if I'm not mistaken. So in this position now, the question is to play c5 or c6. I'm not really sure what the deal is with c6. Now it doesn't make as much sense to me, but that is a move that has been played. Oh, there's a very long variation here. Yeah, I wanted to go over this. So apparently this is all pretty well known. There's some tactics here. Knight takes d5. C takes d5. And I was following this game, Ushanina versus Leno. Looks like they've been programmed to play this by their, you know, their opening database. I mean, this is not a new variation. Relatively recent game, 2012, but I think that this Ushanina Leno game, they're copying older games like Ivanchuk Smirin. Smirin seems like a really big expert. Bishop takes e4. So against Ivanchuk Smirin, bishop takes a1 was probably played, or bishop d7. Yeah, bishop takes a1, e takes f5. This is a little bit iffy. The whole thing with c6 looks very scary to me. So I, you know, didn't want any part in that. I mean, c5, dodgy, a lot of tactical memorization required. c5 is more kind of traditional for this sort of variation. So we get this, and now I'm kind of flummoxed by this here. Some people are playing bishop g4. I can't say I really quite understand. It has a good score over 25 games, not a big sample size, but why would you want to like play bishop g4 and drive the queen to a square where it's well placed anyway? You know, seems strange to me. So bishop d7. And Periodi here knows all the theory. a6, b3, b5. And now bishop b2, best moves, best play by both sides. We've got 37 games. After 16 moves, 14 moves, rook a, b1, best move. Okay, this is the critical position now, probably. Black has two possibilities. Actually 3 or 4, but I'm not the greatest supporter of queen c7 looks kind of lame. H5 looks sort of desperate. And I think that black needs to do something formative here. I mean, you could play e6, I suppose. I don't mind e6. In fact, white often takes en passant on e6, so e6 is interesting. But I think that e5 might be, the way for black to play. Try to get a stake in the center. Not sure if I saw some recent games. If I saw some game with Will Paschall playing white recently, seems to ring a bell. But knight e2. This is apparently best, and very, very complicated play in prospect here. So instead I played b takes c, which is the secondary line, and b takes c, and now e5 still seems like the best idea for black. In that case, if I play e5 at this later stage, he can still play knight e2, probably transpose to the other line. But in the case of d takes e6, I wanted to mention, I didn't understand something here. There was some game with f takes e, and I just don't want to do this. I think that always this pawn sacrifice is something you should watch out for in any kind of Benoni type of position. Always be on the lookout for this sort of sham sacrifice e5. This will just wreck black's pawn structure. So I would think the plan would be to take back with the bishop normally for black. And you can do this with or without the exchange. It may be better for black to do this like without the exchange on c4. I'm not sure that this exchange of b5 and b3 pawns benefits black in any way. So if we go back, I think if we want to do this for black objectively, like it would be better to play e6 or e5 like straight away in this position. So this was my first time playing this line for black. I did okay, considering my opponent seems to know the line very well. And then I played a theoretical novelty here. Knight to g4. No, it's not, actually. It's not a novelty. There's one game, Matnadze versus Jurkovic. This is some kind of ladies tournament, 1999, quite a while back. There are several ideas. I mean, I want to use the e5 square, and I want to play for f5 in some positions, and to discourage f4 because the knight can go to e3. The big fear for black is that the center in this typical Benoni situation would just like implode on black, or explode, should I say. So I think I've seen enough of this type of position to know, although I haven't played it myself. This is the first time. I think that knight g4 is a pretty standard theme. And then in that game, Matnadze Jurkovic, there was h3 played. But I think the white might have better. I'm not sure. I don't think you want to chase this knight to e5. It's fulfilling a very useful function there. Let's see. Yeah, knight e2 once again seems like a very, very good idea. Trading off the powerful bishop on the long diagonal, that's such a key idea. And that actually happened in our game here a little bit later. So my opponent actually played a bad move, though. He played f4. Sorry, he played knight e2. This was fine. Knight e2 was fine. That's the right idea, so he knew that too. But then I played knight e5, and there's a problem for black in this position. And I think knight g4 comes into question, because I just don't quite have enough here. There is the center, and it looks like my knight is on a5, a little out of play. White has the question of the b file. If the b file falls in white's hands, I'm slightly worse. So what are we going to do here? I feel that my knights are a little weird. White has the center. Somehow fundamentally the engine agrees that white's a little bit better, but I wanted something dynamic and I couldn't find it, and it was all based on knight e5. But it looks like it was a fallacy, like this wasn't good enough for me. Here I have to make a concession, like rook takes b2, and I was looking at bishop a4, but I was unconvinced by this bishop a4 move. He could take on a4 and take over the b file. This concerned me a lot, like taking over the b file for white. My knight is just out of the game permanently on a5. I was very unsure if I'm going to be able to make this work. for black with the knight sidelined on a5. So life is pretty complicated here. I thought white was getting the upper hand. And so instead I played knight a5, knight e5, and I get lucky because white played f4, which was a big blunder. Not a big blunder, but enough of a blunder. If he finds this move, bishop a1, or even maybe bishop c3, but especially bishop a1, I cannot do what I did in the game, and he let me do it. f4, and then bang, rook takes b2. This gives black the Jolly Joker. And my good friend, international master Emil Salanci, Dragon and Benoni player, exemplary, likes to do. Larson, of course. Once we get this in, we're out of the woods, as I say, on the way to grandmother's house. No wolf in the woods, and it looks good. Basically, black now has a free pass. We can play for 2 results, like win or draw at this point. We have the initiative now. Rook takes b2, bang, knight takes c4. So f4 was a very serious mistake. Black has the initiative, playing for a win. Knight takes c4, knight takes c4, and he's up the exchange, but he can't really use the b file, and he has tons and tons of weaknesses in the position. Look at all these pawns have moved up. The e3 square is weak. And I found the right move here. I spent a long time in this position. I was thinking about knight a5. I was looking at stupid stuff like bishop to b5. Bishop b5, a4. I actually spent time analyzing that. I'm down the exchange, so I can't afford to sacrifice any more, like 2 pieces for a rook, or I'll be down a piece. So I found this move, knight to b6. And the idea is that knight a4, followed by bishop b5, I create a kind of cohesive, coordinated setup where he cannot use the b file for those 2 rooks. So this was a bad move, rook f3. White started to get into time pressure here, and I think I was too. So we start to get a good setup, and it's not quite enough for a really big advantage. But both sides started making mistakes. Like this, I didn't see the idea of queen e1 during the game, or if I saw it too late. I played queen b4, and white has just enough compensation, or shall we say counterplay, to nullify my advantage. Again, there I missed queen e1. Black is slightly better after queen e1. He probably has to go back, and white's begging for a draw, basically. But I allowed an exchange of queens here and time pressure, and then it's equal. Queen takes, bishop takes, rook to the 7th. An excellent game by white. The evaluation never really shifted above relatively equal. I do have a passed pawn, but he very quickly neutralizes it, and I realized I probably have to sacrifice the exchange to give it back. Here I wanted to play like bishop b6. I don't remember. Yeah, I guess bishop b6 was slightly better, but it's hard to understand. So I played knight c5, and now trade, and it's dead equal. He's going to give back the exchange for this pawn here, and I did manage to win the game in the end, but it was just endgame technique in an equal position. But it is instructive. This looks like it should be a draw, and actually white has more space, but white is a tad bit or a tidbit overextended, and perhaps I should have played g5 around here somewhere, try to fix my pawns on dark squares. But I played rook b8. I was hunting the b pawn, and then white played e5. This is a very risky move, but putting his pawn on the right color. And then I struck with g5. So I'm able to fix all the pawns. If you notice here, 1, 2, 3, 4. All 4 of Periotti's pawns are fixed on the wrong color, and well, that's a good thing. And then soon I'll play a5 when I get the chance. We've got activity. I actually win a pawn here. But he's very resourceful. He keeps attacking all my own pawns, and I allow one to drop. After king e3, I became worried that he was going to trap my rook. This was sort of a fallacy, though. I should have played king f6 here, with even maybe f6, but then my king gets cut off. It's not easy. This is possibly still a draw if white plays perfectly. but I blundered the pawn in time pressure, and this is still a draw, but still black has this minuscule advantage because, again, all of his pawns are on the wrong color, and my king was able to walk up, and you'll see here, this is a bad move. He's a little bit overextended trying to protect these pawns, and I'm able to march my king in on the dark squares. It is kind of a beautiful finish, although it was totally caused by time pressure. It's sort of elegant. So suddenly he's got a serious problem here because bishop e2 meets bishop b5. So he should have played king e1, and he can hang on. Because after king e1, king e3, if I play for mate, he has rook h3 check. But in time pressure, he blundered and played king c1. And then bishop b5, and still maybe with perfect play, he can hang on here. I'm setting up king c3, basically. And now white needs to find some kind of defense. He played g5. This move, I'm not sure why this move is so bad. But after king c3, rook h3 check, bishop d3, and there's no defense. Rook a2, we shift sides to the other side. It's mate on a1. So it just goes to show that you never want to give up. Even in a drawn position, you could keep trying to win. You can find a way to win. You can kind of will the win if the other player doesn't have as much confidence or skill in endgame technique. But objectively, this was a good game that probably should have ended in a draw. But I hope you enjoyed the videos today. There were 3 games, all different kind of King's Indian positions, but I think instructive for beginner, intermediate, and maybe even entertaining for advanced players. So again, thanks for this King's Indian review of my live games on Lead Chess. I'm International Master Will Paschall, and this is Video Chess Training. Don't forget to subscribe and like for this channel. So again, guys, have a great day. Thanks a lot, and check out my live streams on Twitch. Bye-bye.